SUV buyers have never had it so good. In the past few years, a number of manufacturers have introduced electric SUVs at very attractive price points. In this video, we'll take a look at some of the best electric SUVs that you can buy in the USA for under $40,000. Number 1. Mazda MX-30. The all-electric Mazda MX-30 comes with one 143 HP electric motor that drives the front wheels. All-wheel drive isn't available. The all-new 2022 Mazda MX-30 starts at $33,740. For the 2022 model year, Mazda limits all MX-30 sales to California. However, we've also learned that there will be a plug-in hybrid version that'll launch later and will pair an electric motor with a rotary gasoline engine, so perhaps all-wheel drive is still on the table. As its low horsepower rating suggests, the MX-30's acceleration isn't up to par with more powerful rivals, and at our test track, it needed 8.7 seconds to reach 60 mph. The MX-30's 30.0-kWh battery pack is small. The EPA estimates its driving range will only be around 100 miles per charge. The battery will be capable of charging on standard AC power as well as more modern and faster DC chargers. The EPA says the MX-30 is good for 98 mph city, 85 mph highway, and 92 mph combined. Number 2. Chevrolet Bolt EV. The front-wheel drive electric's motor makes 181 horsepower and 199 pound-feet of torque, and it sources power from a 32.6-kWh battery pack. Only 28.9 kWh is usable. The Bolt EV1 LT has a manufacturer-suggested retail price, MSRP, of $31,500, plus a $995 destination charge. The better-equipped Bolt EV2 LT starts at $34,700. When we sampled a prototype Mini Electric, we noted its zippy acceleration. Our most recent drive helped confirm our initial impressions. However, it also introduced us to an overzealous traction control system that prevented us from chirping the front tires and mitigated some of the fun. Still, the Mini's trademark go-kart handling impressed us. We also saw it sprint to 60 mph in a tidy 6.1 seconds, which makes it quicker than other small EVs such as the Chevy Bolt EV, 6.7 clicks. The model features two regenerative braking modes, one that allows the car to coast much like a non-EV car when you lift off the accelerator, and another that's more aggressive and almost eliminates the need to touch the brake pedal. The Mini Electric has an estimated driving range of 110 miles on a full charge. Mini says the car's battery can be fast charged to 80% in 35 minutes. If you're using home AC charging at 7.4 kilowatts, you can completely restore the battery in 4 hours. The little hatchback's 2-mode regenerative braking system also helps to maximize battery charge. The Mini Electric is expected to have a combined mph rating of 108. Number 3. Nissan Leaf. The Leaf, the cheapest EV on the market, it has almost 150 miles of driving range in that configuration. We spent a little over 2 weeks inside the Leaf, on loan from Nissan. We were impressed by how easy it was to start up and go. The 2022 Nissan Leaf starts at $27,400 for the base S trim. For those looking to buy their first EV, the 2022 Nissan Leaf is a great feature-rich entry point. With a maximum range of 226 miles, it's great for grocery runs or traveling around town, though the lower 149-mile range option might not be enough for some. The 2022 Nissan Leaf is available now and comes in 5 different models. The lower-end Leaf S has a paltry 40 kWh battery with an estimated range of 149 miles. This model starts at $27,400, and it's this unit, which after taking the top end of the Leaf range is the Leaf SL Plus. This doesn't have the highest range in the lineup, with 215 miles in the tank, but its $37,400 price tag does include Bose speakers and partial leather seats. The Nissan Leaf has 2 charge ports. One is the faster CHAdeMO charge port, which can charge at speeds between 50 kilowatts and 100 kW, depending on what model you get. This can give drivers an 80% charge around 40 minutes. The Leaf also has a Type 1 AC charge port, which can plug into any old electrical socket, with an adapter, or a fast home charger. Using a standard 120-volt electrical socket means it can take over 2 days to fully charge the Leaf. But most likely, homeowners will opt to have a dedicated charge point installed in their garage, giving a full charge in around 11.5 hours. Number 4. Kia Niro EV. The Niro EV is powered by a single electric motor that produces 201 horsepower, which is sent through the front wheels by a 1-speed direct drive transmission. The 2022 Kia Niro Hybrid has a $24,690 starting price. That's considerably less than any other model in the hybrid SUV class. The price climbs to $29,590 for the entry-level Niro plug-in hybrid. The base model Niro EV starts at $39,990. The Niro EV puts up a brisk 60 mph time of 6.2 seconds. The 64.0 kWh battery capacity of the Niro EV is right in line with the rest of the segment. That battery gives the Niro EV an estimated range of 239 miles, about average among the competition. The crossover can be recharged using either a 120 or 240 volt connection, but the two connections offer drastically different charge times. The 240 volt connection is said to fully charge the battery in about 9 hours. For those who can't wait that long, its standard DC fast charge capability can provide an 80% charge in an hour with a 100 kW connection. The Kia Niro EV we tested traveled 210 miles on a full charge on our 75 mph highway route, part of our extensive testing regimen, and that figure is only 29 miles shy of its 239-mile EPA estimate. Number 5. Mustang Mach-E. The 2022 Mustang Mach-E is available with either a standard range 70.0 kWh battery or an extended range 91.0 kWh pack. These feed an electric motor mounted on the rear or both axles. That latter combination creates all-wheel drive. The 2022 Ford Mustang Mach-E has a $43,895 starting price. The motors combine to make 480 horsepower and up to 634 pound-feet of torque. The GT Performance model we tested hit 60 mph in 3.7 seconds, but it didn't fully live up to our expectations. The version we drove was an extended range, all-wheel drive model that was quick and better to drive than most ordinary crossovers. However, drivers shouldn't expect the Mach-E to be nearly as engaging as the traditional Mustang. Its quiet operation and super smooth ride were most impressive. The 2022 Mustang Mach-E has an EPA estimated range of between 211 and 305 miles. Depending on the battery pack and type of electric motors, every Mach-E comes out of the box with a Ford mobile charger that can add up to 30 miles of range per night with a 120-volt outlet and up to 80% of battery life overnight with a 240-volt outlet. A Ford charge station can also be ordered online and installed by certified electricians, with the ability to replenish 32 miles per hour and recharge the battery overnight. The range-topping Mustang Mach-E with rear-wheel drive and the extended range battery boasts an EPA estimated range of 305 miles. The all-wheel drive version with the extended battery has an estimated driving range of 270 miles. However, there are a wider variety of ranges depending on the model and equipment. The Mach-E with the larger battery that we tested on our 75 mph highway fuel economy route, which is part of our extensive testing regimen, went 250 miles on a single charge. Based on the increased capacity for 2022, we think it'll add about 8 miles of real-world highway range. So this is the best electric SUVs under $40,000 in 2022. I hope you like this video. For more SUV related videos, click any video of them, and subscribe for great content.